This is apropos. NASA is already ordering landers, rovers and drones for a sprawling moon base less than 2 months after Artemis II's record-breaking lunar flyaround. The space agency has been outlining the first phase of its moon base plans, awarding hundreds of millions of dollars in contracts to 4 US companies. Daniel Quinlan has the story.
A stable human presence on the moon, once the stuff of science fiction writers, has taken a small step to becoming reality, with ambitious plans and timelines announced by NASA to have astronauts land on the moon by 2028. They'll be part of a multi-phase public-private partnership to create a sprawling series of bases large enough to support a permanent human presence.
Now, Moonbase 1 will be the first privately funded lunar lander mission in history. The Blue Origin Mark I Endurance lander will deliver multiple payloads to the Shackleton Connecting Ridge, a strategic area of the lunar South Pole.
Phase 2 will see the building of infrastructure from 2029 to 2032. After that, Phase 3 will be permanent presence. At least that's the plan, but many experts say NASA's timeline is unrealistic. And the Americans are not alone. China's space program has been busy. Over the last 3 decades, they've launched 40 manned space missions. On Sunday, the Chinese space agency launched Shenzhou 23, which will see an astronaut orbit the Earth for a year.
I believe that this marks not merely the successful completion of a spaceflight mission, but serves as a significant illustration of the nation's rising technological strength.
China's invested heavily in its own space program. Its ambitions include having their own manned presence on the moon by 2035 and have a crew land there before 2030.
To discuss, we're joined now by the Godmother of Space Law, Dr. Michelle LD Hanlon, Executive Director of the Centre for Air and Space Law at the University of Mississippi. Thanks so much, Michelle, for being with us on the programme this evening. As we saw there in that report, NASA outlining a little bit more detail about its plans for a permanent base on the moon. Why does the space agency feel that this is something that's needed now?
I think there's a couple of reasons. The most important, of course, being this is the next step for humanity as a whole. I think NASA has taken its position as the leading space agency of the world, of the agency that inspired the world with the Apollo missions, very seriously. But you know, your report sort of teased on the idea because we can't forget that this is a race. China is also headed to the moon. The Artemis program, the U.S. space program, was a bit sluggish for the past 5 or 6 years, and now understanding the strategic importance of the moon and our competition with China has really ramped up and given an actual full-blown blueprint to see some success on the moon.
And as we also heard in that report, some experts are, saying this might be a little ambitious. What do you make of the timetable here?
So I'm a lawyer. I'm just a lawyer. I can't speak to the technology, but I can speak to the spirit that we have here in the United States right now, and the spirit of space explorers and space lovers all around the world. You know, when President Kennedy challenged the United States to make it to the moon, nobody thought he could do it. Nobody thought the Americans would be able to do it, and yet we landed on the moon. And so this is the exact same kind of challenge that we're seeing. And I think that our humans, the Americans, as well as all of the partner countries in the Artemis program, are going to see this happen on this timetable.
And how much of all of this is being driven, do you think, by Donald Trump? Some describe this as a pet project of the US president. Is it a lot of this also about, US rivalry with China? Or does that play a role at all, do you think?
I think I wouldn't call this sort of a pet project of President Trump. He did start the Artemis program in his first term, but this is really a very forward-looking strategic plan. And again, it's not just that we are in competition with China, it's that we are in competition with our own Earth. We want to bring Earth back. We're starting to use rare earth metals up. We're starting to use our environment up, and it's time to figure out other solutions. We're not going to find them all here on Earth. So this is a strategic human effort to go beyond and search and to harness the resources that are all around us in space.
And Michelle, you describe it as a space race. Who do you think is on track then to get back to the moon first? And even if we look even further than that, perhaps to make it finally to Mars?
So this is really a wonderful question. What we've seen from China is phenomenal. They have increased their space race, their space pace so much in the last few years. And what's really incredible about China is that they create these 5-year plans. They have 5-year goals and ambitions, and they have met every single one of those in space. So when they say they're going to put humans back on the moon before 2030, I firmly believe they are going to put humans on the moon before 2030. Now, is NASA going to be on that same timetable? NASA, the United States, the Artemis countries have shown us the blueprint. The plan is to get humans back to the moon between 2028 and 2030. But it's much, much more important. The United States is not really focused on getting a human back to the moon. The United States is focused on building the infrastructure that will allow a lot of humans to live on the moon. And so in that sense, in our race with China and this space race 2.0, we call it, this competition, yes, China may put humans back on the moon before the United States, but it's the goal of building that installation down in the very, I want to say, lucrative, resource-rich area in the lunar South Pole, where we think it's going to be the easiest way to harvest the water ice that we will need to support communities, and then eventually plans to go beyond the moon to Mars.
And Michelle, you've written as well previously about the contrast, as you see it, between the US and Chinese lunar strategies. Beijing's program, you say, is more centrally directed and tightly controlled by the Chinese state, while in the US, things are a little more open. Can you elaborate a little bit on that, please?
Absolutely. The Chinese program is lockstep. It's built in with the Chinese military. It's completely run by the Chinese Communist Party. It's very easy for them to set goals and meet them. They just put all of the state resources against it. The United States is taking a very different approach, and even a very different approach from what it did during the Apollo era. The United States is going to rely on its commercial industry. And so NASA is not going to build anything. NASA is not going to spec anything out. NASA, during Apollo, NASA said, hey, Northrop Grumman, we're going to pay you to build this spacecraft for us. We're not doing that this time. Right now, NASA is saying, hey, we want to get this payload to the moon. Who can do that for us? And so we're not just building an infrastructure on the moon. We're building a new economy that is going to be intertwined with space. And so what we're seeing is we're going to see the innovation. We're going to truly be able to use all of the incredible innovation that we have in the United States, these entrepreneurs. This is a very exciting time for U.S. space entrepreneurship because we have the SpaceX IPO coming up. It's going to make a lot of SpaceX people very rich, and probably those people who went to SpaceX because they fell in love with space are going to also build space companies. And so we're not just building a strategic goal of getting to the moon, we're building the future of our economy as well.
And on that note, Michelle, you've also said in the past that human activity in space depends on shared expectations about safety and responsible behaviour. We're talking, of course, about the US, about China, about Russia in the past. But as you say, private companies are also coming on board. So how do you ensure that they're going to have the same kind of ethics that we might expect from governments?
So we actually have a really fantastic treaty. It's only 2 pages long. I encourage everybody to read it, the Outer Space Treaty, which actually asks and requires governments to license and authorize and continuously supervise their companies. And so they must act also in conformity with the Outer Space Treaty. So it's really on the national governments, and the United States in particular has the most robust regulations in the entire world and has taken the lead in things like making sure companies don't just leave all of their junk in space, making sure that satellites are deorbited within 5 years of the end of life. And so the United States is really taking a lead role in trying to assure that kind of responsibility. That transparency is going to be really important. Space is going to get crowded, and we are going to have to reach across the oceans, across the skies, if you will, and work with the Chinese and the Russians and the Indians and the South Koreans, because we're going to start bumping into each other on the moon and in orbit, and we need to know how to deal. We have to create rules of the road, and that is the process that is going on right now at the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space.
And if we look back to the 1970s, Michelle, we had the Apollo 13 mission, of course, which really captured the public imagination. Obviously, of course, the first moon landing also. Do you think people now currently are as engaged or anywhere near as engaged as people were back then? And how do you kind of encourage that engagement if it's not currently there?
So I think, sadly, the engagement is not there in the United States. I think it is very much alive in China, in countries like the UAE. But here in the United States, I think our news is fragmented. You know, when you think back to the 60s and 70s, everyone was watching the same 3 TV channels. And, you know, fun fact, when Apollo 17 landed on the moon, more people tuned in to a rerun of the I Love Lucy show than they did to see that landing. So Americans got really blasé about it very quickly. I try to really encourage people to think about not just, wow, the Americans are going back into space. Wow, humans are going to land on the moon again. I encourage people to think, what does it mean for you? What are you going to do? How are you going to help that? Are you going to go to the moon? And I think, you know, anybody who's listening now, if there's children right now in kindergarten who are going to be building communities on Mars. And so we really have to embrace space as part of our future. And so that's what I try to get people involved, because all of us, I'm not an engineer, I'm a lawyer. Space needs lawyers, space needs reporters, space needs news, space needs bakers. We all need to be a part of this next incredible step for humanity.
Michelle, thanks so much for being with us on the programme and for bringing all your expertise and analysis to the subject. That's Dr. Michelle LD Hanlon, Executive Director of the Centre for Air and Space Law at the University of Mississippi. Thank you. Well, that's it.